For 10 long years, Alexandra Pierce treated Xavier Walker's tiny shop as her personal free dumping ground for all the busted engines her massive corporation threw away. Month after month, like clockwork, a delivery truck backed in, dropping cracked blocks and burnt copper windings and twisted crankshafts. The suits sent a clear message: the struggling single dad only deserved their discarded junked corporate failures. Yet Xavier never complained once. He studied every broken bolt, learned from their mistakes, and raised his little daughter with grease-stained hands. Until one brutal summer, when every single motor her massive company built suddenly failed. Stick with me on this, because we're about to see how a decade of discarded junk held the key to saving their entire failing industry. Mornings in Toledo, Ohio always smelled of heavy diesel. That heavy scent soaked right into the concrete and rusty fences, into the tough bark of whatever trees dared to grow near those old factories and abandoned train tracks that sliced the east side like scars on a mechanic's tired arms. Xavier Walker's little garage sat right on the edge of town, a small cinder block shop with a lift that constantly leaked red transmission fluid, and a simple hand-painted sign hanging above. The shop door read Walker Garage in letters bleached out to a dirty gray. He was only 29 when that Pierce Industrial Motors delivery truck first rolled up. He looked exactly like a quiet guy who had finally made peace with scraping a decent living from what wealthy folks tossed away. His tools were old and mismatched, yet hung with dead-on surgical precision. A solid steel workbench stretched across the entire back wall. Battered and oil-stained, sure, but completely level. He spent 3 hours with wooden shims the day he bolted it, tucked quietly in the back corner, under an old crooked lamp casting a soft, warm pool of yellow light. 6-year-old Grace Walker sat on an empty oil drum, quietly doing her math homework. Her pencil scratched the paper, matching the steady, working-class rhythm of her dad ratcheting a stubborn engine bolt nearby. Then that corporate truck backed right in uninvited. 3 ruined engines rolled off the flatbed on a jack, slammed onto the concrete, the careless drop rich folks use for things they think are worthless. The board driver muttered about clearing out factory floor space. He called them failed engineering test units, and told Xavier he could keep the heavy scrap metal for absolutely nothing. He shoved over a release paper, never once looking him in the eye. Later, some suit named Connor Hayes called from their fancy uptown offices. His voice dripped with the smug arrogance of a man who thinks a mahogany desk makes him superior to working folks. He casually mentioned that their CEO, Alexandra Pierce, hated paying dump fees when a cheap garage was sitting right at the edge of town, run by someone willing to get their hands dirty with dead machines. He said dead like it meant garbage, but you and I know that what those suits dismiss is actually a priceless lesson. Xavier held the phone, staring down at those 3 engines resting on his oil-stained concrete. He stayed quiet. Naturally, the suit assumed it was simple, dumb gratitude. But what Xavier actually felt deep down was pure professional curiosity. He circled the engines slowly, crouching down to study the ruined cylinder heads. I dragged my thumbnail down a jagged crack in their largest engine block. The burn marks on that first motor's windings were totally uneven, proof that the heat stress was completely lopsided. That wasn't bad luck, it was a failure by design. Engine 2 had unevenly worn bearings, proving it warped out of alignment under heavy strain. The third machine had thick rust choking up the oil lines. Eroded metal walls proved their factory coolant mixture was mixed all wrong. Built to look good in a clean laboratory, not to survive real industrial grunt work. I wasn't just looking at 3 broken hunks of metal. I was reading the exact warning signs a multi-million-dollar company chose to ignore. That evening, I tossed a heavy canvas tarp over their trash. My little girl Grace hopped off a steel drum and asked why they dumped trash on us. I told her that just because they discard something doesn't make it worthless. Sometimes, I whispered to her, it is only waiting for someone with enough patience to actually listen. Alexandra Pierce stepped up as CEO 8 years before her delivery drivers started using my yard as a scrapyard. She had just turned 41 when this mess began. Sharp, arrogant, and the kind of executive who walked around like she bought and sold the future. Pierce Industrial Motors was a titan across the Midwest. They engineered massive diesel and electric engines to power massive grid operations. huge freight rigs, mining setups, and massive industrial pumping networks. Back when her father ran things, the brand stood for absolute reliability and brute strength. But under Alexandra, it became all about stock valuations, market metrics, and superficial updates. She honestly believed that success meant being ruthless enough to completely forget your roots. She blindly trusted high-priced consultants and digital simulations. She clung to her executive board and their sterile quarterly spreadsheets. She despised practical expertise and had zero respect for blue-collar grit. And there was no way she would ever listen to a grease monkey running a shop by the rusty train tracks. She never bothered looking at my small garage when her luxury sedan sped past. I was not always a solo operator. 7 years before Grace was born, I worked the graveyard shift at the local steel mill. I was the mechanic who could hear a bad bearing, hearing it grinding 48 hours before the sensors even caught it. I could pace across a deafening factory floor and pinpoint which pump was failing just by feeling the vibrations. My crewmates called it a superpower. I just called it listening. Then my wife, Renee, was struck down by a cruel brain illness. She battled that terrible disease for nearly 3 long years. She met it with fierce dignity, refusing to let a failing body steal her spirit. Right around Grace's 2nd birthday, the deterioration became too rapid for us to ignore. When Renee passed away on a freezing February dawn, the frost actually shattered the thin glass in our front window. I packed my life at the mill into a toolbox and opened my own small garage. I needed control of my time. I had to pack Grace's lunches, rush to her school when she ran a fever, and hold her hand tight whenever nightmares woke her up in the dark. They saw only a dirty garage, but it gave Xavier a raw purpose no shift could. Quietly, he mended whatever battered farm equipment rolled through his heavy doors. Beaten-up diesel trucks and backup generators for local plants. The tough, gritty machines that honest folks couldn't afford to send to fancy dealerships for overpriced repairs. Inside, his garage walls were completely covered with cheap notebooks. No fake motivational posters here, just stacked notebooks, dozens of them. Each spine was carefully labeled with dates in bold black marker. Inside, his neat handwriting tracked exact operating temperatures and daily performance logs. Actual oil pressures, vibration patterns, metal fatigue, and exact points of failure. The brutal truth of how expensive engine parts broke under real-world pressure. Whenever a busted Pearson engine was dumped there, it got a number and its own chapter in his growing archive. He never rushed to sell that metal. Instead, he dismantled every unit, photographing each damaged part first, measuring clearances, noting precisely which parts failed first and which survived the longest. He was quietly building something he didn't even have a name for. An unmatched database of real-world mechanical failure, collected from heavy machines pushed to the limit by working folks who had to survive, tested under brutal conditions no corporate simulator could ever hope to replicate. Beside him, his daughter Grace grew up under those dim garage lights. She finished her schoolwork right next to grease-stained engine blocks. She memorized complex machine parts the way other kids learned cartoon characters. From a young age, she knew her blue-collar father was different. He was nothing like the comfortable dads washing cars in suburban driveways. Never lesser, just quieter, carrying a deep, hard-earned dignity. He carried an inner strength, refusing to let arrogant executives look down on his worth. You and I know men like this. He raised her on raw, honest principles. He taught her that working-class folks simply couldn't afford to make careless mistakes, because reckless errors are a luxury tax only the wealthy can afford to pay. He warned her never to let corporate outsiders define her, because the suits doing the judging were only ever protecting their own kind. And he reminded her of this constantly. That mastering failure is what builds success. A quiet, grinding man holds a rare power that no arrogant executive with a flawed product can ever steal. At first, corporate soused Connor Hayes dumped fresh engine scrap every few months. Then it came weekly, as Pearson Industrial recklessly rushed their factory assembly lines. The corporate release forms he forced on Xavier became increasingly formal. They were packed with legal jargon to absolve them of any future liability. He called Xavier's shop a junkyard in a voicemail. Xavier saved it, but not out of bitterness. He kept it because their blind corporate contempt was incredibly clarifying. It proved the executives truly believed they were just tossing him worthless trash. But those arrogant suits had absolutely no clue what he was quietly building. Meanwhile, Madison Reed, a sharp mechanical engineer 6 years deep into her Pierce career, had heard whispers about this scrap arrangement from someone in fleet logistics. She actually flagged the recurring engine breakdowns during a big company meeting. Let's be real, she argued that studying their broken scrap offered massive engineering data. Naturally, Connor arrogantly dismissed the idea, blind to the man who'd save him tomorrow. They swept those broken engines aside as early production glitches, rushing off to their next fancy board meeting. Up at corporate headquarters, Madison wrote down a warning she actually saved. 10 years into my quiet little setup, they rolled out a brand new engine. Pierce Industrial Motors launched their new PIMX series with a massive press event, packed with major transit fleet buyers, heavy mining bosses and utility executives, plus a trade reporter ready to paint CEO Alexandra Pierce as the ultimate power player, the most dominant leader in the entire manufacturing sector. This new PIMX engine was built purely for peak performance, featuring lighter components and cranked-up compression, with razor-thin engineering margins, advanced cooling loops that their corporate designers proudly called the single most brilliant piece, smartest piece of tech they had ever created. Sure, the motors looked incredible on paper, blueprint specs so perfect you could frame them. Alexandra stood tall at her podium, preaching about the bright future of heavy manufacturing. She had that blind confidence of a leader who never sweeps up her own mess. I did not watch any of it. I was in my cluttered garage, stripping down a junked PIMX prototype that ended up in my scrap heap alongside other broken test engines, weeks before their major launch. But you and I know better. I had already spotted 3 fatal design flaws ignored in their reports. The main oil line return channel was 17% too narrow to handle the extreme heat of heavy operation, meaning when things got too hot, that scorching oil would just puddle instead of circulating, triggering a massive system failure that their pristine lab tests would never catch, but would completely wreck the motor out on the job. The metal in their crankshaft was strong but far too brittle under specific vibrations, the exact shaking caused by rough roads or factory floors. And that delicate cooling loop was designed for sterile laboratory air and mild summer weather, not for the brutal dust-choked work sites where these machines actually have to survive. I recorded every single flaw in my journal, labeling the junked unit, then stacked those secrets next to 10 years of their ignored warning signs. I still remember one freezing night when my daughter Grace was 16 that changed everything for us. I had spent 8 tough months designing what I called my stabilizer unit, an external oil and thermal regulator that I knew could easily be bolted straight onto the PIMX block to bypass every trap I had discovered. It was not pretty engineering. It was survival engineering, built completely out of junked scrap metal, banded onto the engine block in a way that would make corporate suits gag. But watch what happens next. It gave that machine what it needed to endure, not what some clean blueprint guessed. Late one bitter Saturday night in November, Grace and I finally cranked up the modified rig on a junked motor in the shop. She sat on a stool with her notepad, eyes locked on the temperature gauge, calling out readings. The engine roared, held for 40 seconds, then suddenly began to knock like mad. It died with a horrible clatter, like a bag of bolts kicked down the stairs. Grace looked completely devastated. I knelt by the ruined motor in the heavy silence, and I actually smiled. I promised her the knocking was much quieter than it used to be. You and I know failure is just a map showing us where to look. By the time spring finally arrived, my custom oil stabilizer was finally working, and it ran beautifully. I did not patent it, promote it, or share it online. I just quietly installed my upgrade into the broken engines brought to my shop, especially the PIMX motors where the massive corporate dealers rejected the owners. They blamed the honest operators, handing them repair bills that cost more than the machines. A local shipping crew brought me 2 completely ruined PIMX engines. The corporate suits at the dealership refused to cover either machine under warranty. I rebuilt the blocks, installed my custom stabilizer, and handed them back. 8 months later, both of those power plants were still running strong. Word travels fast down here among the people who actually work for a living. No flashy advertising campaigns, just direct word-of-mouth proof. An honest network of working men telling their buddies that some local mechanic saved their gear. High up in her executive suite, Madison Reed heard about my solution during lunch. She quietly requested the maintenance records from that local transport company. She probably read those files twice, staring blankly from her pristine office desk. Look, those massive engine failures did not happen overnight. The trouble built quietly, the way disaster always does, deep beneath the shiny metal. It hid right in the gap between high-tech sensor logs and a motor actually struggling. The earliest warning signs of trouble originally came from a Pennsylvania shipping fleet. They lost 11 massive engines during their very first year of operation. The corporate executives just blamed the drivers, claiming they neglected basic oil changes. Next, a West Virginia coal company reported melted bearings inside 3 massive heavy-duty diesel generators, keeping their deep underground tunnels safe. Their legal team immediately fired back, sending a formal notice of catastrophic failure. A municipal water plant in Michigan suffered a massive pump failure that immediately required a total emergency shutdown of their backup water purification line, triggering a regulatory nightmare that overwhelmed local state agencies in mountains of paperwork. Every single time, the corporate manager Connor Hayes produced smooth legal excuses that shifted the blame entirely onto the operators, using improper oil, poor installation, or running the machinery way too hard. You see, those corporate lies weren't completely fabricated. They just hid the factory defects that left those engines completely unprotected against the rough daily wear and tear of actual heavy-duty industrial jobs. Up in her executive office, Madison completed her secret investigation the following spring. A 40-page report proving the exact same structural failures I had already fixed. This was never about careless operator error. It was a clear pattern of extreme thermal buildup, dropping oil pressure, and shredded engine bearings. Madison had found metal shavings in those filters, clear proof of a design flaw, not operator error. She rammed those findings right through their internal engineering review. Connor Hayes rejected it, claiming her sample size was way too small for any real conclusions. 3 months later, she tried again, armed with a much bigger data set. That time, Connor pulled her straight into his private office. He used that arrogant tone of a boss who thinks a fancy title lets him dictate reality. He warned her she was killing morale by chasing a theory the executives had already dismissed. Madison brought that rejected report home that night. She absolutely refused to throw it out. Then came the public humiliation in September. Pearson Industrial Motors threw a massive press launch for their new PIM-X Titan. A flashy redesign of the old series their marketing people claimed had fixed every single issue with next-generation engineering and rugged durability. They hosted the entire circus right inside their main manufacturing bay. It was decked out for cameras with glaring spotlights and fancy displays. They had a catered spread that cost more than I earned in a whole month. I spotted wealthy investors, local reporters, and 3 stuffy university engineering reps, plus a bunch of major corporate clients this failing company desperately needed to keep. Madison had spent 2 solid weeks fighting with herself. A week earlier, she finally called me, her voice shaking as she asked if I would be willing to show up there as a technical consultant, a mechanic with actual field experience fixing their broken engines in the dirt. I told her absolutely not. But my 17-year-old daughter Grace, with her mother's cheekbones and my tired eyes, looked across our cramped kitchen table and insisted that I had to go. Not for revenge, she told me, but to make them face what they blindly ignored. I showed up wearing my absolute cleanest work jacket. An old green canvas coat, washed until the elbows went soft. I still had a stubborn dark line of grease ground into my knuckles that never fully washed out, no matter how hard I scrubbed my hands. Grace walked right in beside me. Connor Hayes spotted me across the room. His face flashed with panic and confusion for a split second, before locking into pure ugly contempt. He marched straight over and told me, right in front of those wealthy investors and a pair of listening journalists, that this launch was closed to vendors and his CEO did not need any uninvited advice. especially from a mechanic who made a living by digging through their industrial trash. Alexandra Pierce stood near the main stage, holding a glass and projecting fake corporate confidence. She recognized me a moment later. She had actually visited my garage 4 years back, signing off on a massive shipment of her failed engines. I remember her staring at my organized shelves. Looking over my piles of stripped parts, she made a snide remark about my talent for building a whole life out of other people's failures. She probably thought she was paying me a compliment. I sure did not take it that way. Now, she quietly stated that a premium launch was no place for a mechanic from the salvage trade. The massive room did not fall completely dead silent, but all nearby chatter completely stopped. Grace stood perfectly still beside me, her jaw clenched tight, her eyes flashing with something much harder than tears. Look, Madison was standing just 3 feet away, feeling the floor of the glamorous venue tilt beneath her. It was a warning only a real mechanic would catch. I'd spent 2 years begging those corporate suits to fix a fatal flaw they ignored. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't step toward Alexandra or show any weakness. I just stared at their flagship Titan generator, sitting on its expensive display stage. Shined up, its fancy specification placard boasting maximum horsepower numbers that I knew were total lies. I had watched those exact stats fail in my shop. So I asked Alexandra quietly, keeping my voice low so only her executives could hear, if this new Titan motor actually fixed the oil drain defect from her old design. I kept my voice calm. But the engineering flaw was too precise for their corporate PR to brush off. Connor cut me off immediately, and 2 guys in security uniforms grabbed my elbows within seconds. They marched me toward the doors, acting like throwing me out was standard procedure. Right before they pushed me outside, Alexandra threw her last insults at me. She sneered that she only gave me those broken engines as worthless scrap metal. And I shouldn't confuse her casual pity for actual knowledge on how real engines work. I didn't argue with her. I just walked toward the exit, holding my head high and unhurried. At the door, I paused and saw Madison watching from the crowd. I leaned in close and whispered so only she could hear. I told her if that engine shared the same bad oil lines and bearings as the original, it would pass their clean lab tests easily. But it would fail in the real world, right when innocent lives depended on it. Madison just watched me walk away, and quickly wrote my warning down in a small notebook in her pocket. Stick with me here. That ticking time bomb finally exploded the following August. A massive medical warehouse had just installed 6 of those new Titan generators. They served as the main backup power system for a giant climate-controlled depot filled with delicate medicines and highly sensitive biological vaccines. That Thursday, brutal summer storms completely blacked out the regional power grid for 60 miles. Those Titan units roared alive, running smoothly and looking strong for the first few hours. But soon, their engine temperatures started creeping up. 11 hours in, the first machine lost oil pressure, triggering a major overheat warning. At 14 hours, 2 more engines failed. Pressure dropped, heat spiked, and metal shavings tripped the secondary filter alarms. 16 hours deep, the grid was dead, and those warehouse coolers were draining everything the failing units had left. The entire power system collapsed. It was a total cascading failure. Each dead engine pushed massive strain onto the survivors, until the very last motor choked under the heavy demand. When city power finally flickered back on 31 hours later, the storage facility had blown past safe temperature limits for a massive portion of its life-saving medical inventory. You and I know the truth. Damages hit 9 figures, and this wasn't their first engine failure. But it was the first disaster with a paper trail too large and too exposed for their corporate PR machine to bury. The story leaked, hit the national industry magazines, and soon exploded across major business networks. Panic hit her boardroom. Alexandra called an emergency Friday session. By morning, she had just 72 hours to figure out why her engines were dying and stop the bleeding. Her lead engineer admitted they desperately needed long-term data on engine failures. Real messy breakdown patterns across my machines over the years. But corporate had tossed all those early records years ago, right when they upgraded to their shiny new production line. Madison just sat quietly across from them. She finally spoke up, revealing that the most accurate failure logs she knew of were sitting on dusty shelves in my gritty East Toledo garage. Their corporate suite fell dead silent. You know that heavy quiet when the person everyone ignored turns out to be absolutely right, standing right where all their terrible choices were made. For a long, painful minute, Alexandra couldn't say a word. Finally, she swallowed her pride and asked for my number. I was elbow-deep in a 30-year-old tractor when she finally pulled up. I didn't rush out to greet her. I took my time finishing the repair, slowly wiping grease off my hands with a dirty shop rag in my pocket. Standing up, I saw the CEO in my doorway, wearing a crisp blazer worth more than my entire monthly shop insurance. She was staring at my grease-stained shelves with a look of desperation I had never seen. My daughter Grace stood quietly, the back counter, running some heavy numbers on a yellow legal pad. Madison hovered right behind the CEO, clutching a laptop and looking like she had rehearsed this moment for half her career. My shop absolutely reeked of diesel, baking steel, and that familiar sickly sweet scent of gear fluid. Harsh yellow afternoon sunlight spilled right across my dirty concrete floor. Alexandra started with slick corporate speak. She claimed her company urgently needed my engineering insights and promised a massive immediate cash payout. I completely ignored her flashy money pitch. Instead, I strolled over to my grimy shelves, touching the little metal numbered tags. I explained that every piece of scrap matched a detailed entry in the greasy logbooks lined up behind her expensive shoes. I grabbed that first worn-out binder down off the top shelf, flipping straight to the very first broken motor her company had ever dumped here. I read the raw facts without emotion. Uneven heat stress patterns, proving the head gasket could not handle the transfer load. Ruined bearings showing clear sideways shifting during heavy, continuous vibrations. Oil passages completely unable to properly cool down during peak machine operation. I slammed it shut and grabbed another. Let's look at this together. For 6 solid years, I didn't brag or argue. I just read the terminal diagnosis like a mechanic giving you the brutal truth. Alexandra just stood there absorbing it. As my facts piled up, her polished CEO mask slowly began to crack. It was that slow, crushing realization that hits a person when they are finally forced to look at dirty, undeniable proof they can't afford to ignore anymore. Quietly, she asked how long I knew. I looked at her and said I knew for a fact by year 3. You and I both know the lesson here. Corporate ignored me, but I spent 10 years learning from her scrap and building the engine she couldn't. Look, clean computer simulations never show the real dirt. Madison flipped open her laptop right there on my oily workbench and pulled up a detailed comparison chart, matching my greasy repair logs directly against their corporate warranty claims. The numbers lined up exactly. You and I could see it, 2 ends of the exact same broken machine. Connor wasn't even in the room. He wasn't invited. Their chief engineer, hiding away, told us everything we needed to know without a single word being spoken. Alexandra, their high and mighty CEO, stared hard at that screen for ages. Then she finally asked what I wanted. I told her I wasn't out for blood. I didn't need some fake corporate apology to make things right. I just wanted them to admit their design flaw publicly. Stop blaming their customers and actually pay out those claims. Let independent, outside mechanics inspect the factory's current assembly line. And give me fair credit and compensation for fixing their massive mess. Assuming they used my custom fix in their upcoming engine production. I had one last strict condition. Whatever massive restructuring their company ended up doing, they had to protect the floor workers. Those guys just built what they were told and didn't make the arrogant choices that doomed these machines. Alexandra just stared right at me. You and I know exactly why. She braced for a financial shakedown, totally unprepared for simple human decency. I made it clear that I didn't care about protecting her reputation. I only wanted to protect hundreds of honest working-class families from losing their paychecks because wealthy executives were way too arrogant to hear what their own broken motors were screaming. The official engineering stress test began at the main Pierce laboratory 2 weeks later. The entire room was packed with corporate board members. 3 independent mechanical engineers were brought in to judge the final test, plus heavy hitters representing their 2 largest commercial equipment buyers, and a squad of panicked corporate lawyers desperately trying to contain their liability. Madison set up the showdown. I only agreed to it not because I needed any proof, but she warned me that without a massive public demonstration, the suits upstairs would easily bury my repair data once again. We bolted 2 identical engines onto test stands side by side. One factory standard Pimax Titan and one running my custom Walker fix. The test demanded brutal, heavy-duty operational cycling. Extreme heat while pumping filthy dust straight into the intakes. Burned oil, violent and completely unpredictable shaking. Engineered to mimic the rattling abuse of heavy cargo trucks, and backup power generators running at absolute peak demand. Their expensive factory engine actually ran smooth at first. Early power numbers looked solid. Even Connor Hayes, allowed to watch only if he kept his mouth shut, seemed to relax. I caught him actually smiling, thinking he was finally in the clear. I just stood by the blast shield, quietly holding my notes. I did not say a single word for 3 straight hours. We both know the truth. I watched those gauges, waiting for the exact disaster I had already fixed 100 times before. My daughter Grace sat in the observation area with her arms crossed, eyes locked right on me. 4 hours into the test. The corporate engine's oil temperature climbed fast, breaking completely away from their fancy laboratory curve. 5 hours and 40 minutes in. The oil pressure gauge started twitching. You and I both know that warning. I recognized it from my old shop notebook. I quietly pointed the twitch out to Madison. She tapped one of the independent engineers on his shoulder. He stared at the data. He got that dead quiet look when you realize a terrible truth you can't undo. At 6 hours and 22 minutes, their factory engine gave a harsh metallic knock. Their oil pressure plummeted straight down to critical, and the automated safety relays finally killed the power. The room went completely dead. It was that heavy silence when you know something that has been argued forever suddenly stops being a debate and the hard truth takes over. My modified engine just kept humming. Sure, my initial power numbers were slightly lower. I had purposefully traded away a tiny fraction of peak horsepower to completely rebuild the thermal management setup. But my temperature curve stayed dead flat, my pressure rock steady. There was barely any metal debris caught in my filters. An independent tech actually asked why I sacrificed peak efficiency just for extra durability. I told him industrial motors do not break down inside clean laboratories. They die out in the mud when a working man has no backup and cannot wait for corporate service. Building a motor just to pass a corporate spec sheet is making a promise. But keeping a motor running 17 hours into a blackout is actually keeping one. Connor tried brushing my entire test off as a fluke with no long-term proof. Madison calmly placed a bound copy of my 10-year data log right on the table before the chairman. The chairman picked up my thick binder and did not put it down for a long time. Alexandra Pierce, the CEO who treated me like scrap, stood up once the testing session wrapped up. She had prepared some remarks, but she spoke without that slick corporate polish she usually brought. And her stumbling words were the most genuine thing anyone in that boardroom had ever heard from her. She admitted Pierce Motors had made a massive systematic error. Not just a simple manufacturing mistake or a service flaw, but a fundamental failure of knowledge. A complete breakdown in understanding what they actually needed to pay attention to. She confessed they treated every broken part as a PR problem to hide rather than a lesson. Stick with me here, if they had just listened, this disaster would not have cost them so much. She stared right at me when she said that last part. She spoke plainly without any of that corporate spin that CEOs usually use to apologize without admitting they were completely wrong. Think about it. Her company was not destroyed by rival brands or market conditions. It died believing the mechanics they looked down upon had absolutely nothing to teach the executives above them. My little girl Grace just watched me. I stood right beside my test engine, the only one still running. It hummed steady in that quiet room, my bare hand resting firmly on the machine that was about to save them. Not with pride. Not for show. More like reaching a truth you have spent your whole life trying to finally grasp. My girl grew up seeing people treat me like background noise, a glorified dumpster for their broken junk. But she also saw me take the hits without ever breaking, never turning bitter. I never let their dismissive attitude ruin the quality of my work. Standing in that lab at 18, she finally got it. She realized my dusty old garage was not just a symbol of struggle. It was where real resilience was forged. A quiet skill the world ignored, just because I did not care about showing off. By next week, their vice president Connor got suspended. A quick 60-day review followed, and they threw him out of the company. The paper trail proved he had been lying. For several years, in fact. He forced his mechanics to blame their faulty engines on client negligence. He buried my daughter's reports so engineering executives never saw them, all while cutting part quality for 2 full years to boost stock prices. Cutbacks that their own internal records proved were flagged as outright dangerous by at least 2 senior staff engineers. Yet those warnings vanished before the papers reached the board of directors. He quietly resigned without a word. Soon the company had to hand these ugly findings over to their insurers and the state attorneys general pursuing the massive warehouse lawsuit. Meanwhile, their CEO Alexandra spent months in rooms far away from her usual penthouse. She sat face to face with furious clients who lost their businesses because they trusted her faulty machinery. She endured grueling federal safety hearings. At shareholder meetings, nobody cared about profits anymore. They demanded immediate, real accountability. She tried to answer, not well. When you have spent 20 years spinning facts, honesty is hard. We both know how that game works. But eventually, she had to drop the corporate axe for something practical. A brutal, sudden wake-up call. She realized the only way to save her brand was facing the truth. She ordered a massive nationwide recall and published the entire engineering report. Then she signed a major consulting deal with me, on the exact terms I demanded when she stood in my greasy garage. We built a new venture together called the Walker Reliability Lab, a separate shop built for real-world stress testing on heavy industrial engines. I made sure to structure it so their corporate team could never touch us. I remained an outside contractor, not an employee. That boundary was sacred, though I never said why. But frankly, they did not need explaining. My test methods were simple, not fancy academic theories. Just the same real-world science I had practiced in my garage for 10 years. I always pushed those engines way past what their fancy blueprints expected. I tracked where they actually failed, finding the gap between theories and hard reality. Then we fixed the real hardware, instead of just tweaking the corporate paperwork. Madison Reed was my daily bridge between my greasy shop and Pierce's desk engineers. She jumped right in. She had the burning drive of someone who had been ignored for years, and finally had the chance to prove she was right. My daughter Grace chose to wait. She delayed college for a year to swing wrenches with me before starting her engineering degree. A choice I accepted with a very deep, quiet pride, the kind that made me buy her a professional drafting table and some high-end calibration tools I spent 2 full nights hand-picking at the industrial supply shop. That October, the big corporate boss, Alexandra, came back to my greasy garage during our first year of collaborating. She drove up entirely alone, no protective PR team, no corporate shield. She stepped inside my shop and stood in the very workspace she spent 10 years treating like a worthless junkyard for broken scrap. My worn-out shelves remained, the same hand-numbered logs hung on the wall. Even though our little business grew and I moved the heavy engine overhauls into a spacious new storage bay I built on the adjacent lot. Grace was focused at her workbench. She looked so grown up, and when she finally raised her eyes from her project, she stared straight at Alexandra. It was a freezing, quiet gaze that showed she remembered every old insult and knew exactly how to stand her ground. Alexandra sincerely apologized to my little girl before saying anything else at all. No polished public relations nonsense, no safe lawyer-approved corporate script. She told Grace she was truly sorry that she grew up listening to arrogant executives constantly look down on her father as a joke. She confessed she was once the loudest voice mocking my work and admitted she had been completely, utterly wrong. Grace did not offer any easy forgiveness. She hit back with a truth that corporate executive will never forget. She told her I was never just some simple junk collector. I was the only one who saw the true value in their broken machines while they ignored them. You and I know respect is earned. It took them 2 years to earn mine back. Not through expensive marketing, but through proven, rugged performance. That massive Pimax turbine finally retrofitted with my custom stabilizer system and manufactured to the tough standards we demanded in our relentless test shop, finally ran flawlessly on site without suffering the catastrophic failures of the past. Every prototype engine they sent to my shop before release now showed a vastly improved, manageable wear rate. We intercepted critical flaws right here in my shop long before they could trigger multi-million-dollar recalls. The industry standard shifted silently with no fanfare. Because reality always wins once you stop pretending those expensive boardroom theories can replace hands-on experience. I finally owned my shop outright. Patched the leaky roof that had been dripping down my wall for 3 long, cold winters. I bought Grace a beautiful study desk when she headed off to university. A solid, heavy wooden piece with drawers that slid open like absolute silk. But I kept that faded hand-painted sign hanging above my door. You and I should look at that faded Walker garage sign. That is exactly where this story began. Because that weathered sign was hanging there when the very first truck backed in, dumping broken engines and a heavy hidden cargo of pure corporate arrogance. It stayed bolted up when the exact same company that sent those trucks came crawling back to him for help. The humble mechanic they dismissed held all the answers. One quiet Thursday evening in late autumn, Xavier was teaching a handful of bright engineering students from the nearby technical college. They stood in a circle around a torn-down engine block, listening closely as he pointed out the bearing failure pattern. He was the real deal. Just doing what he did best, listening to what the broken metal was saying, then passing that truth right along. He spoke slowly, pointing a grease-stained finger at deep gouges on the bearing surface. The students leaned in the way people do when they are learning a lesson they will never forget. Alexandra stood by the open bay door, waiting on the very man she once treated like scrap. She watched a young student ask Xavier how he managed to spot the massive design flaws that high-priced corporate engineers missed for 10 whole years. Xavier stayed silent for a moment, studying the ruined metal in his hand. He simply said he never cared to prove he was smarter than those wealthy executives. He just refused to discard the broken parts that were trying to speak to him. Stick with me here. Look at that corner shelf, tucked behind the part bins. Sits a scarred piston from the very first engine Pierce Industrial dumped on his lot. Its top was blackened with deep carbon scoring. The ringland was cracked in a specific pattern, proving that the cooling system failed entirely at the absolute worst possible moment. But Xavier never threw it in the trash. He never sold it, and he never hid it away in some dark corner. It sat up there like a monument to the wisdom you only get as a man willing to keep the exact garbage the arrogant bosses decided was totally worthless. Every single student who came through his shop eventually asked about it. And Xavier always gave them the same answer. That busted piece of metal had once been dismissed as a cheap mistake, but it actually turned out to be the opening chapter of a story about what truth costs and where it hides. A fancy blueprint is just a promise. Real survival is the truth that time proves. For 10 years, the dismissed mechanic kept the truths a greedy company threw away. He recorded everything in greasy notebooks lined up on numbered shelves, and in torn-down motor parts organized exactly as they rolled in. But he did not save this junk to build a massive lawsuit. He kept it because he believed that broken machines deserve to be understood. Figuring out why they failed was the key. The wealthy executives hid their failures to protect the corporate stock price. Let us remember this. The humble man you dismiss today might save you tomorrow.